folks, Kayak DIY, and today we're going to do the Pods Challenge. What the heck is this? Not the Tides Pods Challenge, heck no. No, Tides Pods Challenge, if your kids are doing the Tides Pods Challenge, they need a kayak. You need to buy them a kayak because this is, don't even get me started. No, we're doing the Kayak Pods Challenge. What is a pod? It is a mid-hull mounted storage and accessory mounting solution. It's commonly used for adding fishing sonar easily. So, part of the pod challenge would be to do something different. The second I saw the really large pod and the sleek hull design of the Viking Profish Reload, I had to put a motor in it. And that's when the Kayak DIY Ultimate Viking Pod was born. Let's see how it was made and get it out on the water. Here are the steps to building the ultimate pod. The stuff taught in this video might apply to other kayaks as well. Okay, so let's get started. First off, you're going to need a kayak that has a pod system. We're using the Viking Profish Reload Z, which comes with the tackle pod you see there. We also need to get a motor. We chose the Watersnake ASP T24 because it's ultra lightweight and has good pound to power ratio. We also need this mount that you see here, as well as a cutting board material. We're using the cutting board material to make this part that you see here. Okay, so here is pretty much the finished part that we needed to have. So this here is the spacer, and basically it's a 3-inch diameter circle with a little over a 1-inch hole saw center, which I did I think 1 1/8 inch center with the hole saw that you see there, and then this is the 3-inch. And then I simply took this saw right here and I cut a notch out, and this is where the cable is going to pass through, because we need to get the sonar cable and the trolling motor shaft through that hole there. And I'm going to be securing the trolling motor shaft with one of those. So if I just put that inside here, I wouldn't be able to pass the cable underneath. So I need to create a spacer bushing essentially, which that's what this is going to be. So this will sit inside here, and then that will sit on top, and it will all get tied in together with fasteners. So hopefully that makes some sense. You'll see it when it's done here. Okay, so after you've gathered those supplies and you built that one part, you basically have all of the parts needed to be able to mount the trolling motor into your pod. However, let's discuss the accessories on top of the pod. So I used a starport and I mounted that to the top of the pod. Then I mounted this trackport dash 350 on top of the starport. Okay, so having that trackport dash 350 really expands what you can mount, and so I mounted my rod holders and I mounted my fish finder mount. And on the fish finder mount, I'm using the Humminbird Helix 5 SI KVD. It has a lot of useful features and a really good price. I then used this little adapter kit to mount my transducer to my trolling motor. So this is kind of a look at it when I have it all together. Basically, it just is all plug and play, and it mounts onto that one starport. So that created a nice clean look on top of the pod. However, if I were to do things differently, what I would probably do is I wouldn't use the one starport. I would actually remove this little adapter on the bottom of the trackport dash 350, and instead I would drill some holes in the trackport dash 350 aluminum, and I would directly bolt it to the pod instead. That would create a much more rigid mount since I'm using rod holders and other things that are high stress applications. If you don't need rod holders mounted to the top of your pod, then you really don't need the trackport dash 350. Instead, consider looking at the Railblaza E-Series, which has power integrated into the mount, and you could get this fish finder mount, and you'd have a nice clean setup for mounting your fish finder. So first part of the build is stripping down the trolling motor. We need to make it look like this. And to do that, we need to remove the head unit and the transom mount. The head unit is what houses the switches with the speed controls. To do that, we need to remove parts 22, parts 1 and 2, and parts 5 and 6. That will release the motor head unit off of the shaft, and then we're able to just slide the transom mount off. Here I'm removing the 4 screws, which are called part number 22, and I've already removed part 1 and 2, which is the bolt that goes through the shaft and through that housing. At this point, we're able to actually open up the 2 halves and we can see the wiring. We need to take a photo of this wiring because we're going to use it later on when we relocate those switches into the pod, because we're not using this head unit. And at this point also, I would recommend telescoping out the tiller handle. So the tiller handle there, you can see it. You want to telescope that out so that you can remove parts 5 and 6, which are these little clips on each side which hold the wiring in place. Doing that will allow you to slide off the head unit, and then you'll be able to slide off the transom mount. And that brings us to the next step, which is shortening the shaft of the trolling motor. Okay, so first we need to test fit the setup. You need to have your transducer cable ready. You put the transducer cable through the pod first because it has a big cable end that will not fit through once you have the trolling motor shaft in. We'll be able to take a look at that here. Right here you see the cable end of the transducer. That is much too large to go through the pod once the trolling motor shaft is already in the pod. So first put the transducer cable through, then put the trolling motor shaft through, and then we can look at the 3 components that you see here that make up the new mount for supporting the trolling motor. The first component of the new mount is our plastic cutting board part that we made. That is going to be used to create space for the stainless steel part so that it doesn't crush our transducer wire. So as you see here, the transducer wire ends up actually in between that part. That cutting board part is the first part to go onto the shaft. Then we follow it up with this part right here, which is the stainless steel mount that we chose. It has 2 set screws, which are going to be great because we tighten the set screws in order to hold the trolling motor shaft in line with the hull so that the trolling motor does not turn the kayak. Because if that trolling motor shaft spins in this mount, then we will be turning the kayak, and we don't want to do that. We're going to be using the Viking factory rudder kit that uses foot controls to turn the kayak. So that's how we want to turn the kayak, not via the motor. So once this part is slid on over top of the cutting board part, then we can follow it up with the plastic part that you see here, which is part number 12, and it came with the trolling motor. And that basically is a backup to prevent the trolling motor shaft from ever falling out of the bottom of the pod. So this is the configuration right here. And we can use screws or nuts and bolts to fasten it into the pod. I chose bolts, but it was a little difficult to access the inside of the pod. Okay, so now you kind of have an idea of how it goes together. Here I loosely put all the components inside the pod. All the mounting components are there, and I put the propeller on. And then I marked the area on the shaft where I would need a cut in order to make sure that no excess shaft was above the pod. Here I am using a special tool which is great for cutting the trolling motor shaft. You can find this tool in the video description below, and if you need more details on how to go about cutting the shaft with this tool, see the video up in the top right now. So here I am putting it all together, basically putting the fasteners in. I had cut the shaft down and I put it all back together just like we did in the test fit. You can use nuts and bolts, or you can use screws to fasten the mounts together. You will have to drill or screw through the cutting board material to get to the pod, since the cutting board is in between the stainless steel mount and the pod. Okay, so quick little run through. We have our transducer mount, which mounts to the trolling motor. That was an item that we bought. And then the cable of the transducer is zip tied to the trolling motor shaft. Notice that we do have a decent amount of gap in between the propeller and the bottom of this pod. I actually probably would have put it down even a little bit further because I get a little bit of turbulence noise from having the trolling motor still pretty close to the bottom of the pod. The trolling motor shaft and the transducer cable come through the pod, and then we have our series of 3 components that make up the mount. And on the end of the trolling motor shaft, I ended up epoxying the end so that way water wouldn't get into this part of the trolling motor, because that's where the magnets are, and you could easily end up locking up the motor because of rust. So if water goes down the trolling motor shaft and into there, it's not going to drain out. It's just going to sit in there and rust. And so by epoxying the end, you prevent that from happening. But what you need to do is you need to make sure you're epoxying the end of the trolling motor shaft when it's laying horizontal, because otherwise the epoxy could run into here and lock up the magnetic part of the motor. So that is kind of a little fail safe that I incorporated to prevent the motor from having damage. Because on the ocean and rough waters, you're gonna get this area wet. It's just gonna happen. Water will probably even get into the pod because there's no major rubber seals. I mean, if you're kayaking hard enough, water probably could get into this area. So you just want to make sure that you have the end of this epoxied so that way water doesn't get into the motor. I drilled a hole right here, and I passed the blue, red, and black wires of the trolling motor into the pod itself. And what that allowed me to do is I was able to take the switches out of the head unit of the original trolling motor, and I mounted them into the pod. I used a razor blade cutting knife to cut the square holes, or the holes for these switches. It was actually pretty easy. Just take a razor blade, put some pressure on there, and it will cut right into this pod. And then to pop these out of the housing, the original housing of the trolling motor, you simply, on the inside of this, there's these little clips, and you just press and squeeze, and they'll pop right out of the housing. And so then when I wanted to reuse them in the pod, they simply pop into the pod now. As far as the wiring for these switches, hopefully you took a photo of how to go about wiring them. You are going to wire them the same way that they were originally. So when you're taking the head unit apart, hopefully you took a photo of the inside of the wiring before disconnecting. So now here we are, and we have our switches nice and accessible from the cockpit area of where we're seating. Looking here, we have the Railblaza track port set up. I have to kind of keep the housing on its, or the whole pod on its side because of the trolling motor. But here we have our fish finder mounted to the track port dash, and I only have one star port supporting this, which is what I mentioned. I might end up taking this piece here, this track port dash, drilling a hole here and in here, and just bolting this whole aluminum piece, this mount, this track port dash, directly to the pod, and not use the star port mount. So that's kind of what I'm thinking, only because you'll notice that there's a little bit of play in here, maybe not a ton, but enough that I want to, I think, make it a little bit more secure. So the pod is really ready to go, but we need to figure out what type of batteries we're going to be using. So I'm going to be using this battery because I've used it in other builds, such as the one you see in the top right hand corner right now. And I'm probably going to be using this battery in the long run for the fish finder because it's ultra lightweight and I don't want to put too heavy batteries in the pod.